It was on August 28th, 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered what would become known as his "I Have a Dream" speech. It began as a rather ordinary civil rights speech. Parts of it are even a bit clunky. When all at once a woman shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And Dr. King spoke from his heart and soul. He painted a vision of a better, more just, and peaceful world. A world where it is a self-evident truth that all people are created equal, and where the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would be able to sit down together at the table. A world, a country, where his 4 little children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King had a dream that was inspired by God's dream for our world and for every person living in it. Today, Jesus, quoting Isaiah, gives a kind of "I have a dream" speech in the synagogue. Filled with the Spirit, Jesus proclaims God's dream of good news coming to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed, and Jubilee. Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. In God's dream, people held captive by hatred and fear and anger would be released. People blind to the sins of racism and judgment and greed would have their eyes opened. People oppressed by poverty and injustice would be set free. Jesus proclaimed this year of the Lord's favor. It was called the Jubilee year. Every 50 years in ancient Israel, according to Leviticus, no crops were planted. The land was given a rest. Property was returned to those who had been forced to sell it. Debts were forgiven and slaves were set free. Jesus proclaims this Jubilee year when inequalities would be rectified and the dignity of those on the margins would be recognized. Jesus proclaimed God's dream, a more just and peaceful world, a world where the dignity of every human being is recognized and respected. A world of compassion and equality and love, where each person is recognized as being made in the image and likeness of God, the image and likeness of love. God's dream. God's dream was spoken by Isaiah. It was embodied in Jesus. And it was held up by Dr. King. But God's dream has not yet come true. In another speech, Dr. King suggested this. He said, "It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all." St. Paul spoke to that today. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Pope Francis wrote an encyclical about what he called an integral ecology several years ago. It lifts up an integrated and holistic approach to political, social, economic, and environmental problems. It suggests that we have forgotten our interrelatedness, our connectedness, our communion with each other, with God, and with the earth. It's interesting that the Jubilee year proclaimed in Leviticus and spoken about by Jesus in today's gospel included forgiving debts, freeing slaves, and letting the farmlands lie fallow. It was intended to reestablish right relationships. Relationships with each other, with God, and with the earth. This is God's dream. But God's dream has not yet come true. If you've ever seen the statue of Dr. King in Washington, D.C., you know that it is carved from a huge block of granite. It depicts a dignified-looking Dr. King, arms folded, eyes looking far off in the distance, far off, to a time, perhaps, when God's dream would come true. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, Jesus said, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Having just emerged from the waters of baptism, where God's Spirit had crashed down upon him and proclaimed, "You are my beloved Son," Jesus stands before the people of his hometown and embraces these ancient words as a personal mission statement. But Jesus doesn't just repeat some nice-sounding words. He doesn't just deliver a nice speech. He lives out those words in everything he does from that moment on. Healing the sick, feeding the hungry, challenging authorities, reaching out to those on the margins, and teaching about the overflowing, unconditional love of God. And he pays for it with his life. Some people don't like what he does, who he associates with, what he teaches. He upsets the established order, threatens their unfair advantages, questions their complacency. And so they seek to bring an end to him. But they cannot. Because his message, his life, his love is stronger even than death. And so it goes on. It lives on through his followers, through us. As Charles Hoffaker reminds us, now the way Jesus works is through his mystical body, the church. Through each of us and all who are baptized into his body, Jesus strives still to live out his mission statement, bringing good news to those who don't have any, setting free those chained in captivity, opening blind eyes, helping the oppressed and exploited find a life, and unrolling the floor plan that sets out God's reign where justice and peace prevail. That's nice, isn't it? He says Jesus still does these things because his people, the church, do them. The poor gain hope, whether it's their souls or their bodies that are starved. The captives experience freedom, whether they're prisoners in a jail or prisoners in a mansion. The blind receive sight, whether it's cataract surgery or the scales of prejudice falling off the eyes of a bigot. The oppressed are set free, whether oppression is a political regime or a chemical dependency. When Jesus reads that passage in the Nazareth synagogue, he announces a mission statement for himself and for his body, the church. God's dream for us and for our world has not yet come true. God is counting on us, fellow followers of Jesus, to proclaim and to live out the mission of bringing good news and proclaiming release, recovery, and freedom to all of God's beloved children. May it be so. Amen.